It's my distinct pleasure to introduce the other Yank here today from the other side of the pond, doing a talk on it's called The Skeptical Neurologist. Ladies and gentlemen, please say hello to Steven Novella.
Thanks, George. Well, thanks for having me in Manchester. This has been a wonderful experience. Always nice to get out and make some new friends. I love Chris French's talk, but he talked about the sneeze that turned out to be the air freshener, and I have to tell you my own personal version of that story. We were investigating a haunted house, and the claim was that the lights would turn themselves on and off. And you know what we found? They were on a timer. So it was true, they were turning themselves on. All right. I'm about to show you now, don't get up. I'm about to show you the greatest threat that the skeptical movement faces. This is the thing that is at the core of all of our problems. Here it is, you ready? That's it. It's also the source of our salvation, if you will. This is both our best tool and our biggest obstacle. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. Earlier, George was asking me what I was talking about. I was like, quickly, it's about how the brain sucks. That's basically, in a nutshell, what I'm going to talk about. All the ways in which the brain is not the perfect tool that we think it is. That, in fact, our concept of how our own mind works is nothing but an elaborate, evolved illusion. And there's many, many, many ways in which it breaks down. You've already had some lectures going over some of the ways in which that happens. I'll touch on them as well, but try to give you a bit more of just an overview of this tool, this hunk of meat in the top of our skulls here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the primitive instinctive aspects of our brains, what I like to euphemistically call our monkey brains. Problems with perception, memory, thinking, altered states, and decision-making. So first some basics of brain hierarchy. The brain is a hierarchical organ. There are more primitive components to the brain that do the basic things we need to do to keep alive. And then there are newer and newer parts of the brain built on top of that have higher and higher levels of hierarchical control. But the more primitive parts are still there. So, the brain was not designed from the top down from the beginning. It's clearly a kludge, an organ that has evolved over time with new parts being grafted on, and it's sort of cobbled together in this very complicated way. The most primitive part of the brain, sometimes we refer to this as the lizard brain, because this is basically all that reptiles have, is the brainstem and the midbrain. So that's involved with real just stimulus response and breathing and regulating autonomic function and reacting to the environment. But there's almost no thinking part of the brain in reptiles. And then when mammals have a primitive cortex. It's greatly expanded over reptiles, but it's still what we would consider primitive in that it's mostly instinctual. This is where the limbic system is, which is involved with emotion. So when you feel something or when you do something and you're not sure why you did it, that's all coming from this sort of primitive cortex. Some researchers have likened this to a committee. Basically a bunch of different centers in the brain and networks that all have their own concerns, all arguing with each other about what you should feel and do. And that all gets presented to the neocortex, or the new cortex. This is what's most expanded in humans, and what is most different about, say, our brains versus a chimpanzee brain is that we have this massive frontal lobe. You can see it on George very well over there, how high and front that comes. So that's and why the sort of sloping forehead of the chimpanzees is because they don't have that frontal cortex. This is responsible for what we call executive function, planning, self-control, understanding the consequences of actions and then deciding not to do them, and all of the social interaction that we do. If you want to see human behavior with an underdeveloped frontal cortex, I will make another George joke, but what you want to look at is children, right? If you have any parents out there, sometimes it's amazing that children are not little miniature adults. Their brains are not fully developed, and one of the ways in which they're not fully developed is that their frontal lobes have not yet really been fully developed, and they haven't exercised them yet. So the kids are very transparent in wearing their primitive monkey brains on their sleeves, if you will. And when they make these clumsy attempts at concealing their true desires, they're utterly transparent. That's because they haven't become more sophisticated yet in compensating for their more base emotions. But one of the primary differences between children and adults is that we're just better at it than they are. It's not that we don't feel, all of the things that children feel, emotions that we may characterize as immature. It's that we do, but we have this frontal lobe which tells us this is socially unacceptable, so I can't let other people know that I'm feeling these things. So like the one thing that was really cute that my older daughter did, I was playing with my younger daughter and giving her a lot of attention, and my older daughter just said, "Hey, what about me? Hey, I want attention. Why aren't you giving me attention?" And she just said it. That's the kind of thing that we all feel as adults too, but we know it's socially unacceptable to go, "Hey, pay attention to me. I'm feeling neglected." So you come up with some more subtle, convoluted way of gaining attention, for example, of drawing attention to yourself, of inserting yourself into a conversation. And some people are better at that than others. So that's what a lot of our frontal cortex does. Not that it doesn't also give us control, and as we age, we do genuinely mature. There's actual studies now which show that the reward system and the more primitive system of the brain is actually much more active in teenagers than it is in adults. So they actually have much more pressure coming from the more primitive part of their brains than do adults. And adults tend to have more active sort of frontal cortex and therefore more self-control. A lot of what is going on then in day-to-day, in our day-to-day lives, is this constant battle between the primitive monkey brain telling us to eat the cheesecake and to respond to somebody who cut you off by swearing at them and flipping the bird and all these things that you want to immediately do, and the social planning executive frontal cortex that's telling you that wouldn't be a good idea, that's not good for you, that has concepts of justice and reciprocity, these complex social things that we evolved. They're constantly in conflict, and whenever they are in conflict, that causes what we call cognitive dissonance. Oop, there's a problem. I want to do something, but I know I shouldn't do it. So we find some way to resolve that cognitive dissonance. The most common way we do that is to rationalize the behavior that we want to do. We don't convince ourselves, for example, not to do it. We say, "Oh, I could eat the cheesecake because I exercised yesterday," or it doesn't have that many calories. And then we resolve the cognitive dissonance, and this is now fMRI studies show this, we get a little shot of dopamine to our reward center. Our brain actually rewards us for resolving our own internal cognitive dissonance by making us feel good. That's good. Yeah, don't worry, it's all good. The cheesecake doesn't have that many calories. We're good. That's your brain at work day to day. You think that you're in control of what you're doing and what you're thinking and what you're feeling, but the vast majority of it is this committee of different evolved instincts vying for your attention and vying for your behavior. And then this thin layer of executive function, which is mainly at work resolving the conflicts and making you feel better, rather than actually planning things that are good for you. So when people do things that are incredibly stupid, that's why. It's just because their frontal lobe's lost. But that is, in fact, the default mode of human behavior. Okay. This was just to show you the different parts of the brain. So here's the brain stem. This is the lizard brain right here, basically. The limbic system is largely the cingulate gyrus and then midline structures. And then here's the expanded frontal cortex that allows you to think. All right. So there are many ways in which this is a very flawed tool, and understanding all of these flaws can be very empowering. Of course, the tendency is to just make it better at rationalization. That's unfortunately what happens. That with education and sophistication, we don't necessarily make better decisions. We just rationalize our poor decisions better in a more sophisticated way. But still, at some point, you do get to, this sort of almost cognitive therapy where you can, through a pattern of learned behavior and modes of thought, you can get better at executing or at using your executive function rather than caving into your monkey brain. So our brains are flawed in numerous ways. We have imperfect perception, processing, and storage of information. We're fundamentally emotional, not rational creatures. We're self-aware of only a small percentage of our actual own information processing. Most of what your brain does, you're not aware of. It's just all happening behind the scenes for you. And people can be essentially on autopilot, where they're just sort of doing whatever their brain tells them to do without stepping back and trying to exert some kind of overriding control. And we have lots of perceptual and cognitive blind spots, some of which you've already heard about in previous lectures. And again, fMRI studies show that a lot of our decision-making is actually subconscious. There's now this famous study where neuroscientists looked at the human brain in the process of decision-making, essentially like a left-right decision on a screen, and they were able to predict about 60 to 70% of the time whether the subject was going to choose left or choose right about 6 seconds before they registered that they were aware that they've made the choice. And you could actually see the decision-making parts of the brain making the decision, and then later the subject executing that decision. So what does that, how do we interpret that? What does that mean? It means the standard interpretation at this point in time, again, this still requires further exploration, is that the most decisions that we make are made at a subconscious level for evolved reasons, and then are presented to that part of our brain which is the sort of in control, the executive function, what we call the global workspace, which is sort of making everything work together. And then that conscious self can either accept or reject the decision that was made on a subconscious level. That's what appears to be happening. But again, this is something that requires further exploration. I'm going to talk a little bit about perception. Obviously, optical illusions are an excellent example of how our visual processing is not objective. But the entire brain is organized this way. The visual system is just a really good concrete example. But really, this is how our brain works in general. And there are illusions or ways of tricking or breaking down the processes of the brain in ways other than just optical illusions. There are many, many cognitive illusions as well. But just to give a couple examples, so we actually don't really see objectively the outside world. We receive only a fairly arbitrary narrow band of sensory information, of all possible sensory information from the outside world. And then we take that narrow band of sensory information and we only pay attention to a small slice of it. And that slice gets processed heavily. Certain things are de-emphasized, other things are accentuated. There is, essentially false color is added, contrasts are enhanced, assumptions are made, a three-dimensional model is reconstructed from many assumptions about the two-dimensional information that we're getting, and it's stitched together in a temporally so that you get this seamless sequence of events. All of it is bullshit. It's all an illusion. But it creates this sort of seamless perception experience of a continuous visual experience. That is not an objective or simple, like camera-like representation of reality. So that results in the ability to generate optical illusions. And optical illusions are exploiting some fact about visual processing, usually some assumption that your brain makes about what's true most of the time. And then you manufacture a situation in which it is not true, your brain gets confused, reconstructs the image incorrectly, and that's what an optical illusion is. And that theme about your brain making assumptions about what's true most of the time, but it's wrong some of the time, is one that will come up over and over again. Again, this applies to cognition as well as vision. This is just the most in-your-face example of it. So this is obviously an impossible figure that cannot exist. I think my laser pointer is dead. And here is just another very, very common illusion. Are the lines straight or wavy? You see them as wavy when, in fact, these are straight lines. This just is the way that your brain creates contrast from transitions to light and dark. Do you see anything in this picture? You may at first see nothing. At some point you'll see horses in this picture. But once you see the horses, you can't unsee the horses. That's really what's interesting about this illusion, not that there are these hidden camouflaged horses in the picture. So there's ambiguous stimuli here, and there are not actual horses here. There's just a suggestion of horses. Your brain is filling in the gaps. But once your brain makes the decision that these are horses, that's the best match that it can make. It's pattern searching horses. Now I'm going to fill in all the other missing details to make it look like horses. And once your brain does that for you subconsciously and presents the image of horses to your conscious self, you cannot unsee the horses. They're there. But the entire outline of the horses is not there. You're filling in the gaps. Your brain is subconsciously filling in the gaps for you, just like we cognitively fills in the gaps for you and presents this illusion of a consistent world that is seamless, but it's mostly a fiction. All right. Other things about fiction. Very interesting fact about vision is that there are multiple different visual systems in the brain. Once the basic processing has occurred and we have the image of a horse, for example, then that image is further processed to give it meaning, because things that are out there in the world need to have some meaning for us. Otherwise, why should we pay attention to them? And visually, our brains divide the world into agents and non-agents. And an agent is something that can act of its own will in the world. A non-agent is something that does not act with its own will. Now, this is not exactly the dividing line between living and inanimate objects, because an inanimate object may behave as if it has agency. And when it does, we visually process it as if it were an agent. So we're more interested in what kinds of things in my environment can influence me, can act upon me, do I have to be wary of, versus which kinds of things will not move of their own volition or not out to get me. And that's not the same dividing line as living or dead. That's probably why we can feel emotionally that cartoon characters are real entities, even though they have none of the attributes of a living thing, but they do have all the attributes of an agent, right? It's also why we probably think that, this leads to another thing, a cognitive bias that we have called hyperactive agency detection, which I'll get to a little bit further down in the talk. That's the notion that we tend to make this assumption that things have agency even when they don't. The other ones speakers have talked about change blindness or attentional blindness. That's the selecting a tiny, portion of the visual information that we come in to pay attention to and to weave our narrative from, and ignoring other bits of information. And sometimes the choices that our brain makes about which information to weave into the narrative is arbitrary. Other times it's based upon attention. It's also based upon a lot of just rules that our brain follows in terms of what's most likely to be important to me. Does it have agency? Is it moving at me? Is it moving in my visual field, etc. There's also hallucinations. Now, illusions are when you misinterpret external stimuli. Hallucinations is when you generate internal stimuli. So if something arises entirely from your brain, that's a hallucination. And this occurs in a variety of situations, not just in the mentally ill, not just in schizophrenics. It can occur just with sensory deprivation. You turn the lights off in a completely dark room and you will start to see visual blobs and images and ghosts, because your visual cortex is now uninhibited by and unoccupied with external stimuli, so we'll start filling the gaps with internal stimuli. And this gets more interesting when there's actual lesions in the brain, like a stroke or whatever, where parts of the visual cortex are damaged. Then you may actually see completely formed hallucinations. You may see people in your room with you that are not there. If it's purely visual, then generally there's no emotional context there. You'll know that it's not real. If the hallucination derives from the reality testing part of your brain being impaired, then you will think that the person's there to get you, right? Then you think they're really there, and they are there for some reason that has to do with you. So there's different types of hallucinations that our brain will generate depending on which part of the brain isn't working. We have an inability to judge distance, size, and speed because we make a lot of assumptions in trying to determine those things. Again, that's subconscious processing, subconscious decision that's made by the visual association cortex, and then the best guess is presented to your consciousness, and that's what you perceive. And you can't distinguish between an accurate construction and an inaccurate reconstruction until something happens that causes it to shift, like something moves in front of something else. So people may see a small object that's very close and moving very slowly, and their brain may make incorrect assumptions and perceive it as being large, fast, and far away until it moves in front of something that's nearby, in which case, boom, the image will flip and suddenly you'll see it as small, close, and slow. But you can't control that. That's not something that you can control. That's something that is subconscious and is being presented to you. And again, pareidolia is old news to skeptics, right? Our brain is pattern-seeking. We like to find meaningful patterns, but we err on the side of seeing patterns that aren't there to the point where we will impose familiar patterns on ambiguous random stimuli. So here's a couple of just examples of pareidolia. This was a bank in Florida that image was actually there for a couple of years without it deriving any attention until someone said, hey, that looks like the Virgin Mary. Then it was a miracle, right? And everyone paid attention to it. But it's just like a stain on the window. And this is one of my favorites. This is a natural land formation. This is Medicine Hat in Canada. And the white line is a road that was added later. I mean, they should have actually gone up a little bit further so they didn't have low set ears. And this was also used as like a advertisement for an iPod, because obviously she's listening to her iPod. But this is, again, you're sort of filling in some of the gaps, you're filling in missing lines to make this vague suggestion of a face look more and more compelling, but you really can't not see the face. You can't unsee it. It's there. All right. So our perception of the world is a fiction with lots of assumptions and is easily broken. And the fact is, it works well enough most of the time. We're not constantly tripping over things and walking into things, right? But working most of the time means that throughout our lives, it's going to fail a lot of the time. It's going to break down. And most of us will just take that as, whoa, wasn't that a freaky illusion, and then go on with our lives. But if you're looking for evidence and anomalies of weird stuff, then your everyday experience is going to give you plenty of opportunities to think that you've seen something anomalous or unusual. And then your memory of it is going to be completely twisted. Because memory is just another fiction. You don't have any reliable memories. As disturbing as that is to really fully wrap your mind around, whenever we study memories, you do something objective like, and this has been done, take students after a major historical event, the Challenger exploding, for example. You ask them, what were you doing when this happened, or when you heard about this happening? Write it down. You do this to freshmen in college. You go back to them as seniors and say, what were you doing when the Challenger exploded 4 years ago? And you have them record their memory of what they were doing. And there's almost no match between their recent memory of what they were doing and what they recorded they were actually doing 4 years earlier. The mismatch is astounding. You can further ask them, how certain are you that your memory is accurate? And there is no correlation between certainty and accuracy. Now, I don't care how certain you are that you remember something happening a certain way. The evidence shows, no, you don't remember it accurately, and your certainty is irrelevant. But nobody wants to hear that. And that's not a very compelling answer to the believer who has this memory of having had this experience. But the neuroscience is completely unambiguous. And there's many ways in which memories will change over time. You can fuse memories. You can take a detail from one memory and fuse it with another memory. Our memories are highly selective. Again, just like we pay attention to certain visual stimuli, you may ignore. You have attentional blindness for the gorilla. You also have memory blindness for things you don't want to remember, which basically means things that don't fit your narrative. Again, that's sort of the overarching concept here, is that your brain constructs a narrative of reality for you, and it stitches together, ambiguous information in order to construct that narrative. It has enough of a relationship with reality that it's adaptive and you can survive and you can interact with your environment. But again, it constantly breaks down. And it's really not meant to be scientifically accurate, to deal with subtle questions or complicated questions. It's meant to make down and dirty rule of thumb assumptions that work most of the time in straightforward situations, so you can make quick down and dirty decisions, knowing that they're going to be false a lot of the time. So you may be good in a situation where you have to think quickly in the environment, but you're a terrible scientist. You have to impose order on your brain. You have to impose, controls and record, control for your terrible memory, control for your terrible perception. Otherwise, you will just be fooled into pretty much believing what it is you're trying to believe. Whatever confirms your narrative. That's the huge bias that we have. There's false memory syndrome. So if you tell people that something happened to them, they will form a memory of that happening to them. And this has been done psychologically, where people have been asked to remember an event that happened in their childhood. And in fact, some experiments have actually gone to length, like showing them photoshopped pictures of themselves, like in a hot air balloon, on a vacation that they had someplace. It's a complete fiction. It never happened. And after a while, they have a compelling memory of this event that never happened, that's indistinguishable to them from any other memory of anything that happened in their past. It's a completely fabricated memory that they cannot distinguish from reality. So that's been generated in experimental conditions. I mean, the evidence, again, is overwhelming. Also, we have different kinds of memory, of long-term memory. Basically, we have a thematic memory and a detail-oriented memory. The thematic memory is basically, what was the meaning of this event? I remember that I was threatened and I had to run away to avoid being threatened. Something very basic, broad brushstroke theme. Or you might remember that it was a tiger who had this coloration, was this size, he was standing on a rock, whatever. Just you remember all the details about the situation. Those memories are actually stored in different places, and they're not always connected together. And also, the other thing that happens is when the thematic memory shifts, when we tell a narrative that resolves our cognitive dissonance and is more in line with our overall narratives that we're weaving inside our heads, we then happily adjust the details to fit our new thematic narrative. Right? So it's not as if memory is just randomly bad, where details are lost or they shift. That happens. But we actually deliberately, and I mean our brains, the way our brains process information, those details don't shift randomly. They actually shift to be in line with our thematic memory, which is really just this fictional story we tell ourselves to be consistent with our image of ourselves, our view of the world, our thinking about how the world works. So if you think there are ghosts, and then you go to a haunted house and you have an experience, and you think you saw a ghost in the haunted house, because that's all now consistent with the narrative that you tell yourself, over time, the details of what happened, your memory of those details are going to shift to reinforce the thematic story that you tell yourself. So, therefore, a year from now, you're going to remember in detail a ghost encounter that never happened. And those details will be compelling to you, and you will be completely unaware of the fact that they were specifically fabricated to reinforce that false story. That's how our memories work. It's a fiction. It's a narrative. All right. And this is when the brain's working well, which is not always the case. There are lots of things that make the brain break down even further. our brains are capable of existing in different states, which can be altered in various ways. We all experience an altered state of consciousness when we dream. When you dream, you are yourself. You have awareness. You can form memories. But it's not really your waking self, is it? You have trouble making sense of what you were thinking and what was happening in a dream because it was a different version of your conscious self when you're dreaming than your conscious self. And that's because a different subset of your cortex was active to different degrees. One thing of note is that your reality testing is dialed way down when you're dreaming, which is probably a way of keeping you in the dream. If you were constantly reality testing your dream, you would tend to wake up. So to keep you dreaming, we evolved the dream state to turn off our reality testing so weird things happen and you're like, and you accept it. And then when you evaluate it as your waking self where your reality testing is turned on, it's like, that makes no sense. Why did I believe that or buy that? Because it was an altered version of yourself. But there's other situations that will do that as well. Sleep deprivation is also a very common situation in which our brain function can start to break down. Our sloppy perception becomes even worse, for example. And it's already been mentioned elsewhere that you can have actual sleep paralysis and waking dreams. You can get a fusion between your waking self and your dream self. You can also have seizures. Now, seizures are an electrical phenomenon that can alter your brain's function. It can cause a part of your brain to be overactive, and then it becomes underactive when it's recovering from being overactive. And that's two different states that occur every time somebody has a seizure. Or there's a long number of things that can cause encephalopathy, which basically means your brain's not working very well. Probably the most common one is just alcoholic intoxication, right? When you get drunk, you make stupid decisions because your frontal lobes, you're inhibiting your frontal lobes. That's primarily what alcohol does. It inhibits your cerebellum, so you stumble around, and it inhibits your frontal lobe, so you make stupid decisions. And you say things you wouldn't ordinarily say. You become more sociable because you're more disinhibited. So that's just some semi-selectively turning off parts of your brain. And hypnosis is interesting as well. Hypnosis is, I actually don't think of it as an altered state. It's one of the normal states that we're in. Being awake is not one state either. There's multiple different states that we could be in when we're awake, depending on our prevailing emotions and mood, for example. But also, for example, if you are engrossed in a task, that's one state where you're highly focused internally and on a small subset of your stimuli, and your suppression of other extraneous details becomes extreme, to the point where you might not notice something happening right in your visual field because you're just not paying attention to it. Or you might open up your awareness to your environment in general and try to take in as much information as possible and be aware of your environment, but you're not really focusing on anything deep or narrowly. So those are two different states that we can sort of voluntarily put ourselves in, where we're processing information differently. Now, hypnosis is just a way of inducing in people a version of consciousness in where they're actually highly attentive. They're not in a trance. They're not sleepy. They're actually very alert and very attentive, but they're being very selective in what they're paying attention to. So you could slip things in under the radar while they're paying attention to things. But this is a normal state for us. It's just sort of maximizing this effect through this sort of ritualized, hypnosis. And then you can affect people subconsciously in ways that affects their decision making, because that's how the brain works. We make most of our decisions subconsciously. Okay. So there's, again, lots of things that influence decision making. Bias is probably the first one. Most bias derives from our cognitive dissonance, the fact that we have an ego. Our ego makes us want to feel good about ourselves, to avoid social embarrassment, to protect and defend our prestige in the social order, because this is important to our survival, to attract a mate. So the egos have survival advantages, and that's why it's so strong in us. So when the ego is threatened, that causes cognitive dissonance. And then we very aggressively search for a way of resolving that. So we're really good at rationalizing our own flaws and faults. And this leads to what we call the attribution error too. So we happily explain away what we do due to external factors. The simplest example of that is if you trip while walking down the sidewalk, what do you think? Oh, there was a crack in the sidewalk. Of course I tripped over it. If you see someone else trip down the sidewalk, your first thought is, clutch. That has been demonstrated psychologically very clearly. That's the fundamental attribution error. We happily explain away our internal errors, our personal errors as external factors, and we are happy to explain other people's flaws as inherent flaws to them. And we just do that day in and day out, and that is just all about resolving cognitive dissonance and ego gratification. We are pattern-seeking creatures, so that goes well beyond audio and visual pareidolia. We actually will see patterns in events. And this actually leads to conspiracy thinking, because now we can see the invisible hand in operation behind what are otherwise disconnected events. But we're hardwired to look for coincidences, things that might have a common thread. And when we think we see the common thread, it's very compelling to us. Okay, we all have a little conspiracy theorist living inside of our heads. And that conspiracy theorist is telling you, look for the pattern of events and try to explain it all by some dark conspiracy against you. Because that's the way that you're going to perceive and avoid threats to you before they occur. Now, a certain amount of paranoia, and as the saying goes, right, sometimes they are out to get you, right? Sometimes the paranoiacs are actually accurate, and it's all about balance, right? If you had absolutely zero paranoia or ability to consider the possibility that there are threats to you, whatever that may be, whether it's to your career or your job or your family or your physical self, that would be very maladaptive. You would constantly be abused and wouldn't be able to defend yourself. If it's hyperactive, then you see conspiracies everywhere. So there's Aristotle's philosophy of the mean is that most virtues are a balance between two extremes, and this is a good example of that. You want to have it just enough to be functional and defensive, but not so much that you see patterns everywhere. But now pattern recognition, the biggest check on pattern recognition is our reality checking. So our brain is constantly looking for patterns, and when it thinks it sees a pattern, it says to the reality checking part of our brain, hey, is this real or is this not real? And our reality checking part of the brain compares it to everything we think we know about the world, our narrative, our models of reality, our models of ourselves, and also our ego and our emotion, and says, yes, this is real, or no, it is not real. And then we accept or reject the apparent pattern that we see. Now, some people have hyperactive pattern recognition, other people have hypoactive reality testing. We all have a different balance of these two committee members in our subconscious arguing with each other, pattern, not a pattern. And the end result is what we think we see in the world. But it's interesting to be aware of this process because our frontal lobes can superimpose upon this primitive committee an actual process of evaluating information objectively, the scientific or this critical thinking process. That's really the critical thinking, and skepticism is basically turning control over to your frontal lobes and imposing upon yourself a more of a systematic, mathematical, controlled way of looking at data and overriding the primitive monkey brain committees that are arguing about which evolved tendency or bias is dominant in this particular situation. I already talked about hyperactive agency detection. The ultimate manifestation of that, one might argue, is the belief that there is a deity, the ultimate agent who's acting in the world, and everything that, the fall of every sparrow is due to this agent. But we tend to see agents everywhere, and again, you can weave very compelling evolutionary just-so stories about why this might be true. If you hear the bushes rustling in the dark, you could assume it's the wind, a non-agent, or you can assume it's a tiger who's about ready to eat you, an agent. We tend to assume it's the agent because that will motivate us to defend ourselves. So our ancestors who assumed it was a tiger who had hyperactive agency detection, well, they are our ancestors. Their colleagues who did not assume that are dead, and they're not our ancestors. We are descended from people who had hyperactive agency detection because it had an adaptive feature. It may not be so adaptive now that we live in a complex technological science-based civilization, but we could argue about that. We also have a huge bias to confirm things we already believe. We don't like changing our minds. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of cognitive work to change your model of the universe, of how things work and how things are built. So we have an inherent bias to confirm what we already believe and to ignore or dismiss or explain away with rationalization bits of data which are disconfirmatory. And confirmation bias is a massive influence on everything that we think we see and everything that we think we remember and everything that we believe. And if you're not continuously aware of it, it basically will dominate what you think about the world. That's just the way our brains are built. We have certain emotions. I mean, there's obviously a lot more than what I have here, but just a few that are fun to talk about. You know, we dislike uncertainty. We crave certainty. Uncertainty is also a lot of cognitive work and causes cognitive dissonance. And so it takes a certain amount of maturity and executive function to say, all right, I'm going to force myself to be comfortable with uncertainty, even though emotionally I don't like not knowing the answer. We have a desire to control. We would love to be able to control every aspect of our world, ourselves and in our entire environment. So typically, we will either exert actual control over our environment, or we will just give ourselves the illusion of control, which is the more easier thing and the more likely thing to do. That will resolve our cognitive dissonance. A shot of dopamine. That feels good. I actually do have control. That's what superstitions are. That's what feng shui is and magical beliefs. I can do this magic ritual and it will give me control over the uncontrollable, the things that I can't predict. I don't like to think that I could be struck down by a random event that means nothing. I don't like to think that. So I'm going to give myself the illusion of control with magical ritual and superstition. We have a desire to be liked and to be perceived positively by our peers. It's important to our survival in a social community. And so we are hugely biased toward portraying ourselves in a positive light, even when we have to massively lie about that. And we all know we're doing it. We know we're doing it when we're doing it. We're just really good at covering up. Another fun thing to observe about your kids is when they're terrible at covering it up, but they're still trying to do the same things that we're doing. We're just really good at it. Heuristics are specifically, they are mental shortcuts. These are down and dirty rules of thumb that our brains are evolved to use that are right most of the time, and therefore it's a good first approximation, but they're wrong often enough to cause a lot of mischief. And just to give you a few examples, there's a representativeness heuristic where we think that if one thing has superficial similarities to something else, that it must be similar in other ways. The availability heuristic is probably the most subtle one. We reach for explanations that are available to us, that are immediately in front of us, and we will often stop there at the explanation that's right in front of our face. And then we reinforce it with confirmation bias. Problem solved. There's anchoring. That's why we like round numbers. We sort of anchor to things that are concrete. It's easy to exploit this in marketing. You know, 5 for $1. Or it's 1 for 20 cents. But people are going to buy 5 because they're being told it's 5 for $1. You can anchor people. They're so manipulatable. You can manipulate people so easily once you know what their heuristics are. Because these are the buttons that you have to push to get people to do what you want. However, I'm going to leave a few minutes for questions, but my last slide is just, this may seem very doom and gloom, but I'm actually not very doom and gloom. I'm very optimistic. As I said at the beginning, the brain is maybe the biggest hurdle we have in front of us as skeptics, but it's also the tool of our salvation, because you can use critical thinking skills to override all of the things that I talked about, or at least make a good try at it, a good effort, because of our hierarchical brain. It is still ultimately true that our executive function, the most evolved and sophisticated part of our cortex, is ultimately in control. It is hierarchically above all the primitive stuff that I am talking about. But you have to be aware that this fight is constantly going on inside your head, and all of the rules of thumb that you tend to make, and all of the biases in your thinking and your processing and your memory of information. It's a lot of work to know all that, but this is what skepticism is largely about. It's largely about a body of knowledge that we're pulling from the neurosciences and psychology and just science in general and philosophy to understand how the human brain works, so that we can get it to work better, to use it as a tool. I mean, if you don't understand the primary tool that you have, then obviously your results are not going to be very good. But we have knowledge now that's carefully built up over centuries that enables us to trump all of these flaws that I talked about, and that does give me great optimism for the future. Thank you. I'll take a couple of questions if anyone wants to come up to the mic at the center of the room. The lovely George Hab will MC any questions you people have.
We got time for a few. Yeah, sure. Come on up. Come on up.
Just a quick question. Do you feel that false memory could explain almost all of the vaccine autism link?
It certainly explains a lot of it. A lot of it's confirmation bias. But when you have parents that tell you, my child was normal, they got a vaccine, and then they regressed into autism, you could be almost certain that that story is BS. And when you look at these studies, whenever you have any kind of controlled information, what you find is parents say, my child was normal before they got the vaccine, and you find out they were not normal before they got the vaccine. So they conveniently forget all of the signs of autism that occurred before the vaccine. There's also a process, a memory process, very specific, known as telescoping. And that is, we tend to shorten the distance between two thematically related events over time. So maybe it was 6 months after the vaccine that they really decided, okay, there's something going on here. Again, when parents finally are aware that there's something wrong with their child is not a moment, unless there was an actual event. For developmental problems, there's this growing awareness which gets to a critical point where they go, okay, something's going on here. We've got to bring this child to a neurologist. And then when you ask them a year later, when did they realize their child had problems? It was a week after their vaccine, but it really was 6 months after their vaccine. They telescoped the memory of those two events. So, yeah, along with a lot of the other things that I said, confirmation bias and cognitive dissonance and all that, all those things are at play in giving people this very compelling, profound certainty that the vaccine caused their child's autism, when in cases where you actually have the objective facts, they don't match what they believe at all. Sure.
Hi, you've made a convincing argument that our brains pretty much decide what we're doing and
Yes.
then we just do it. And although you finished with the optimism thing, you've also said that we're also very good at convincing ourselves anyway. What I wanted to ask you is, earlier on we were thinking about determinism, and I was wondering whether you believe in determinism, or do you think we have free will?
This is the free will question? Yeah. So, do I have another hour? Let me sum up very quickly. This is a long discussion and debate about do we have free will? And I think if you define free will as a causal free will, meaning that we are free from deterministic physics, then the answer is clearly no. Our brains do not exist outside of the material physical processes of which they are made, and we're just carrying out whatever physical processes are happening in our brain. But if you ask, can we make conscious decisions, the answer is yes, you can make decisions. Whether those decisions are ultimately causally determined by the physics of your neurons is kind of a separate question. So my default answer is, well, it's yes and no depending on how you look at it, but you might as well act as if you do have free will because you can make decisions.
You mentioned people with superstitions and doing magical rituals to get a shot of dopamine and feel better, basically. Are you saying that everyone who's superstitious essentially has a low-grade form of OCD?
Well, OCD is one of those things that we all have, right? We all have some kind of ability to be obsessive-compulsive, and it exists in a happy, functional medium, and when it becomes too extreme, we call that the disorder of OCD. And of course, when it's not there at all, then again, people are inattentive and have the inability to concentrate. They're not detail-oriented. And then there's this happy medium where we can really pay attention and be bothered that there's some detail I'm forgetting. There's a certain amount of adaptivity to that. So the short answer is we all have OCD. It's just mostly it's a bell curve, and we're mostly in the adaptive balance, but some people have it way out to an extreme where, they have to check the lock 100 times, not just once, If you check it once, you're normal. If you check it 100 times, you have OCD. But if you don't check it, you're sort of down towards the other end of the spectrum. But we're all in there somewhere.
Hi. Would you say neuroscience suggests that our conception of the self is an illusion?
Yeah, largely. I mean, interestingly, everything that you think about yourself and reality is a internal narrative or illusion, if you will. That word could be misleading. That's generated by specific parts of your brain that have evolved to do that. And even things that you would take for granted. So you feel like you're inside your body only because your brain's telling you you're inside your body. And if I turned off the part of your brain that tells you that, you will feel like you're outside your body. I can trick your brain in an experimental protocol. I can trick your brain into thinking that you're in somebody else's body. I can trick you into thinking that you don't own your arm, that your arm has a separate agency, that you have an extra arm growing out of the side of your body that you do own and have agency of. I can attach your agency to something that's non-existent. Every aspect, even things that you've never considered before, of how you construct your image of yourself, where you are in reality, the world outside, that you are separate from reality, all of these things are things that your brain has evolved to specifically do, and there is a neurological correlate to it in your brain. And now with our fancy transcranial magnetic stimulation and fMRI, we could turn it on and off and see what happens. So more and more we're showing that, yeah, everything basically is just the narrative that your brain constructs because it's adaptive, and it works well enough, even though it's massively flawed.
Hi Steve, I'm Dave Hughes from the Hampshire Skeptic Society. Given that our perceptual bandwidth is limited and that we seem to create this illusion of reality around us, do you think it's possible at some point in the future when computational resources reach a sufficient level that we might be able to simulate the incoming information and map what we should be thinking about it so that we can create some new and ultra-convincing optical illusions much, much better than the ones we experience now? I mean, real head wreckers is...
You mean like the Matrix? Is that what you're talking about?
No, not that kind of thing. Like with the dice, I mean, that's obviously a brain fail.
Yeah.
But I mean, something that's old now. It's been around for I don't know how many years.
Yeah.
But something that's real, a complete side.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think I'm serious about the Matrix. There's no limit. I mean, because again, if you can take total control over the inputs to your brain, you can create whatever narrative or illusion that you wish, depending on how sophisticated your ability to do that is. Like I already alluded to the fact that there are experiments with virtual reality where we could put VR goggles on somebody and give them a certain visual and tactile feedback that makes them feel as if they are inside this virtual self that is being made by the computer. If you could make people feel that they're in a virtual body, you can make them experience almost anything. We just need to figure out exactly how to exploit all the different levers and interactions in order to create the experiences that we want. And we're doing that. We're making good progress doing that. I don't know how long it's going to be before we can have enough information to actually make something that approximates the Matrix. I don't know if it's going to be 50 years or 100 years or whatever, but all I can tell you is right now that paradigm is working really well and we're making steady progress.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi. On what you were saying about cognitive dissonance earlier and getting the dopamine reward for resolving it, how easy is it to trick the brain into giving you the dopamine without having to eat the cheesecake?
Yeah, so... Yeah, that's the goal, isn't it, right? To make yourself feel good about yourself because you didn't eat the cheesecake. So that's basically what psychologists have been doing for decades. They just call it cognitive and behavioral therapy, where you sort of change the way you think about things and you change your pattern of behavior so that your reward system is rearranged to reward you for things that are adaptive and functional and healthy, and to stop rewarding yourself for things that are maladaptive or destructive. So, and that can happen because of the other cause for optimism is plasticity, is that your brain can actually incrementally evolve and change its hardwiring in order to adapt to new patterns of thinking, which is why thinking critically over time is good, because then your brain gets in the habit of thinking critically, and you start to feel good about yourself for thinking critically rather than creating the illusion of control or something else. So I do think that you can actually affect the way your brain functions by, again, adopting the habit of critical thinking.
Oh.
Sure.
With regards to what you're saying about children not having developed frontal lobes,
Yes.
does that mean they find it hard to learn critical thinking? And if so, is there an ideal age to teach them critical thinking?
Yeah, I think but critical thinking is just a very cognitive thing. So it's actually easier to get children to understand what they should do. It's harder to get them to actually do it. And again, I love watching my daughters grow up as a neurologist. I mean, I do as a father too, but I'm also, there's the neurologist in behind the father going, isn't that fascinating? So when, like, recently, I could stand in front of my daughter, she's doing something I don't want her to do, and I say, don't do that. Stop what you're doing right now. Stop. Don't do it, and she does it right in front of me. And of course, part of you also wants to wring her neck, but I don't do that because I have a frontal lobe. But I could see in her eyes this underdeveloped frontal lobe struggling to prevent her from doing what her monkey brain is telling her to do, and it loses. It's just not up to the task, and she is compelled to do it, and she does it, and then she immediately rationalizes it. I had to do that because of completely transparent BS. It's so fun to watch that happen right before my eyes. And you realize that the same thing happens in adults. You start to watch adults behave, and they think, and then they come out with a really sophisticated rationalization for why they had to do what they did, but they're still just doing what their monkey brain is telling them to do.
So is there an ideal age to teach a child critical?
Yeah, at birth. Yeah. I don't think it's ever too young to start the critical thinking as a worldview and a way of thinking and a way of behavior. But again, they won't be neurologically capable necessarily of acting on it, but I don't see any limitation in their ability to understand the critical thinking.
And with that, ladies and gentlemen, Steven Novella.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.